The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and central heating turned up too high. Nora Calder sat in a chair that was too soft for a woman who had spent the better part of 2 decades sleeping on canvas cots in packed dirt, and she kept her hands flat on her thighs because that was the only way she knew to hold still when everything inside her wanted to move. Rex sat beside her, not on the floor the way most people expected a dog to sit, upright, shoulders square. His dark eyes moved slowly around the room the way Nora's used to move when entering an unfamiliar building in a place where unfamiliar buildings could kill you. 6 years old, black and tan, with a chest broad enough to stop a man mid-stride if he walked into it. Rex did not fidget. Rex did not pace. Rex simply watched, and the watching itself carried weight. The lawyer's name was Dunmore. He had the kind of face that had probably been forgettable even when it was young and age had not improved it. He read from the document in front of him with the practiced neutrality of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it had stopped feeling like news at all. Nora listened. She had learned a long time ago that listening was not the same as hearing, and hearing was not the same as understanding, and understanding was not the same as accepting. She was somewhere between the second and the third. The house went to work, the land went to work, the truck, the tools in the garage, the small savings account, the John Deere that had needed a new alternator for the past 3 winters. All of it went to Warwick Calder, elder son, primary beneficiary, the one who had stayed. Nora received nothing. The document said so plainly. It did not explain. It did not apologize. It simply stated the fact the way a stone states its own weight. Warwick sat across the table. He was taller than Nora remembered, or maybe just thinner, the kind of thin that came from years of careful eating and a certain anxious relationship with the mirror. His brown hair had gone mostly gray at the temples. He held his hands folded in his lap and did not look at Nora directly, which was something he had been doing or not doing since they were children. Sylvia sat beside him. She was the kind of woman who made a room feel organized just by entering it. Dark blonde hair pulled back without a single strand out of place. Pale skin that seemed deliberate somehow, like a choice. She had a ceramic mug of coffee in front of her, and she held it with both hands, even though the coffee had long gone cold. She had looked at Nora exactly once since she sat down, assessed her the way you assessed a piece of furniture you were deciding whether to keep, and then looked away. She was the one who had called, 2 weeks ago, left a voicemail that said their father had passed and that Nora's presence was requested for the reading of the will. Requested, like a meeting, like something optional that had a correct and an incorrect response. Nora had driven 14 hours from Fort Drum, where she had been staying in a motel near the base, while she figured out what came after the army. 3 tours as a combat medic in Afghanistan had given her a particular set of skills and a particular set of difficulties and very little guidance on what to do with either of them once the uniform came off. She had driven through the night with Rex in the back seat, and the radio off because music felt wrong and silence felt correct. She had arrived at the house at dawn and stood in the driveway for a long time before going inside. The house had been the same warped floorboards, the same low ceiling pressing the air down into something thick and close, the same kitchen table with the burn marks from decades of use. But her father's coffee cup was still on the counter unwashed, the coffee dried to a dark ring around the inside, and that was the thing that had hit her hardest. Not the grief exactly, more the specificity of it. The fact that the last thing her father had touched in that kitchen was still sitting there waiting to be washed by hands that no longer existed. She had stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time looking at that cup. Rex had pressed against her leg, warm and solid, and she had let him. Dunmore finished reading. He slid the document across the table. Warwick signed where indicated. The pen scratched against the paper with a sound that was too loud for what it meant. Sylvia waited until Warwick set the pen down. Then she opened the leather folio on the table beside her and removed a second document. This one she did not hand to Dunmore. She pushed it across the table herself directly toward Nora with 2 fingers like she was moving a piece on a board. A supplemental waiver, she said. Her voice was even controlled, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in a room where no one could hear her. Standard procedure in contested estates, she said. Just a formality. She placed a pen on top of the document with a small, precise click. Nora looked at the document. She did not pick it up. She did not pick up the pen. She looked at it the way she had learned to look at things in places where things were sometimes not what they appeared to be. In Afghanistan, she had learned that the most dangerous things were rarely labeled. They looked like everything else. They looked like road and like rock and like the ordinary texture of a day that was about to become something else entirely. Rex shifted beside her, not aggressively, just a small reorientation the way he always moved when something in the room changed in a way that his instincts registered before hers did. Warwick cleared his throat. He was looking at the table now. His hands were still folded, but the knuckles had gone slightly white. "You don't have to decide tonight," Warwick said. "Yes, she does," Sylvia said. She said it pleasantly. The way you said something you had already decided was not up for discussion, with the tone of a woman who understood that pleasantness was more effective than force and had made her peace with deploying it as a weapon. Nora pushed the document back across the table, not toward Sylvia, toward the center where it belonged to no one. She stood. Rex stood with her immediately without being asked. She said nothing to Warwick. She said nothing to Sylvia. She picked up her bag from beside the chair, adjusted the strap across her shoulder, and walked out of the room. Rex followed at her left side, close enough that his shoulder brushed her leg, with every step the same position he had held for 6 years, in rooms and in fields and in places that were considerably less comfortable than this one. In the hallway, Nora paused beside the kitchen doorway. She could see the cup from there, still on the counter, still waiting. She kept walking. The front door opened onto cold. Real cold, the Vermont kind, the kind that had weight and intent. Snow was falling not heavily, but steady, the kind that committed. The porch light was on, but it reached only as far as the steps, and beyond the steps, the driveway dissolved into blue-gray dark. Nora stood on the porch and breathed. The cold air came in clean and left something complicated behind it, the way cold air always did when it found lungs that were carrying more than oxygen. The door opened behind her. She did not turn. She heard the soft sound of paper, the slight crinkle of an envelope. Then Sylvia's hand appeared at her peripheral, pressing a small white envelope into the pocket of her jacket. Her touch was brief, professional. The touch of a woman who had thought through every contingency and had prepared a material response to each one. "In case you reconsider," Sylvia said. Then the door closed. Nora looked out at the driveway, at the road beyond it, which went down into the valley and eventually into town, where there was a motel and a diner and the kind of ordinary human noise that reminded you the world was still functioning, regardless of what was happening to you personally. She thought about the motel. She thought about a bed that was not stone and a room that was heated by something other than her own body. She thought about the diner and coffee and the sound of other people living their ordinary lives around her. Rex stepped off the porch ahead of her and then stopped. He stood at the edge of the light, looking down the driveway toward the road. His ears were forward. His tail was low, not tucked, just still. The stillness of consideration rather than fear. Nora stepped off the porch and started toward the road. Rex moved in front of her. Not aggressively, not with a sound, just moved the way water moved around a rock. Except in this case, the water was a 70-pound German shepherd who had decided without consultation that this particular direction was not the correct direction. Nora stopped. She looked at the dog. Rex looked back at her. "Move," she said. Her voice was quiet. It was always quiet, now had been since somewhere around her second tour, when she had noticed that loud voices startled her, and so she had stopped using one. She had learned to communicate in smaller registers in the compressed language of people who had discovered that most things could be said with less noise than the world generally used. Rex did not move. Nora stepped left to go around him. Rex stepped left. Nora stepped right. Rex stepped right. Then he did something he had only done twice before in 6 years, both times in situations that had later proved to warrant it. He stepped forward and closed his teeth gently around the cuff of her jacket sleeve. Not biting, not pulling, just holding. A signal. The specific signal that meant, I need you to stop moving and pay attention to something you are currently missing. Nora stopped. She stood in the cold and the dark and the steady, quiet snow, and she looked at her dog. Rex released the sleeve after a moment and turned his head. Not toward the road, the other way, east, toward the tree line, toward the ridge of mountain that rose behind the property, toward the dark line of forest that her father had told her once when she was 9 or 10 years old was not a place for them. Some places aren't ready for you yet, her father had said. Not dangerous, not forbidden, just not yet. She remembered standing at the edge of the yard in her rubber boots, looking up at that ridge, trying to understand what that meant. She had never asked a follow-up question because something in the way her father said it made follow-up questions feel like the wrong kind of curiosity. Like asking why a locked door was locked. The question itself changed your relationship to the door. She looked at the ridge now, dark, still, the snow falling against it without sound. Rex had already started walking. Nora stood alone for another moment. She thought about the motel in town. She thought about the diner. She thought about the envelope in her pocket and what was probably inside it and what Sylvia had meant when she pressed it into her jacket with the efficient touch of a woman executing a prepared strategy. She thought about her father's coffee cup still sitting on the counter inside, and about the document she had not signed, and about the look on Warwick's face, which had been the look of a man who knew something was wrong, but had decided that knowing was close enough to doing something about it. Then she followed her dog into the trees. The forest changed the quality of the cold the moment she stepped inside the tree line. The wind dropped away, and the cold became something denser, more settled, the kind that lived in the ground and worked upward rather than sweeping in from outside. Snow collected on the branches above and fell occasionally in small, silent bursts that landed on Nora's shoulders and the back of her neck and melted immediately against the warmth of her. The trees here were old. Not the uniform new growth of managed land, but the irregular sprawl of trees that had been left entirely alone for a very long time, their trunks thickened by decades of undisturbed growth, their roots working through the surface of the ground in patterns that required attention to navigate. Rex moved ahead with the kind of focus that Nora recognized from their work together. Not the playful investigation of an animal following a scent out of curiosity, but the directed, purposeful movement of something that already knew what it was looking for and was simply navigating toward it. His nose worked constantly low to the ground, then lifting, then low again. His ears stayed forward. His pace was steady, not rushed, but completely undeviating in a way that told her he was tracking something specific rather than exploring something general. They climbed. The property behind them disappeared behind the first rise, and then there was only forest and slope and the particular silence that mountains made when everything in them was sleeping under snow. Nora's legs knew this kind of terrain. She had climbed worse ground in worse conditions, carrying considerably more weight than this. Her body moved through it automatically, reading the slope, adjusting, placing each boot with the habitual care of someone who had learned in places far from Vermont that the ground was not always what it appeared to be. The bag on her shoulder was light. Everything she owned fit into something she could carry. That had been true for 20 years, and she had stopped thinking of it as a limitation sometime around her second deployment, when she had watched other people struggle with the weight of accumulated things and understood that there was a particular freedom in traveling light, even if the circumstances that had produced that freedom were not ones she would have chosen. She pulled the envelope from her pocket as she walked. It was sealed. Her name was not on it, which meant Sylvia had prepared it in advance of handing it to her, which meant she had expected Nora to refuse the document at the table, which meant the envelope was not as she had said, in case Nora reconsidered. The envelope was the plan. The document at the table had been the opening move. This was the second. She opened it without stopping. Inside was the waiver again folded small, and beneath it a single sheet, a photocopy of something official. A land record, a parcel number, a property description that placed the boundary squarely around the eastern ridge, the ridge she was climbing right now, the forest her father had told her was not ready for her yet. The name on the land record was not her father's. It was Margaret Wren. Nora stopped walking. She read it again. The parcel boundaries, the recorded owner, the date of original filing, which was 1968. She looked up at the trees around her, at the slope above, at the ground under her feet. Her father had never owned this ridge, which meant neither did Warwick, which meant the signature Sylvia had wanted from her tonight, the one she had described as standard procedure and a formality, had been something else entirely. Had been a firewall, had been a legal barrier constructed to prevent a question from being asked by the person most entitled to ask it. Rex had stopped a few yards ahead. He was looking back at Nora with the patient expression of a dog who understood that humans sometimes needed a moment to catch up to what the situation actually was. Nora folded the papers and put them back in her pocket. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. It was one of the things about her that had made her good at her job, the ability to feel a very large thing and let it settle into her body without letting it reach her hands. She had held instruments in conditions that would have made steadiness impossible for someone who had not specifically trained for it, and that training had become her default state regardless of context. She started walking again. They climbed for another 20 minutes. Time moved differently in the forest at night, slower and more honest, without the artificial markers that made days feel organized. The slope steepened. The trees grew closer together, their roots exposed by the uneven ground, catching at the snow in dark tangles that required her to lift her feet higher with each step. The air changed in a way that was subtle but real, something in the temperature and the quality of the stillness. Not warmer exactly, but more contained. Like the cold here had been sealed rather than left open to the wind, like something large was holding it in place. Rex slowed, then stopped entirely. He was standing in front of a section of slope that looked at first assessment like every other section of slope. A natural rise of rock partially buried under snow, tangled with dead branches and old vine growth that had frozen into place over seasons of accumulated ice. The kind of feature that the eye moved past because there was nothing in it to hold attention. But Rex was not moving past it. Rex was standing with his entire body oriented toward it, ears forward, eyes fixed, the complete stillness that meant he had found something and was waiting for the human beside him to catch up. Nora looked at it, really looked with the deliberate attention she had been trained to apply to surfaces that were presenting themselves as ordinary. The snow was wrong. Too smooth in certain places, too shallow in others. The vine growth was dense, but it had grown around edges, around lines, rather than over an uninterrupted surface. There was geometry underneath it, right angles where nature preferred curves, the specific signature of something that had been made by hands rather than by time. She moved closer, brushed her gloved hand across the surface. Stone, but cut stone, placed stone. The kind of stone that had been worked with intention and fitted with patience. Rex began to dig, not the tentative exploration of a curious animal, but fast and deliberate, his paws throwing snow back in sharp bursts, his nose pressed close to the surface between movements. Nora crouched beside him and used her hands brushing and pulling, clearing the accumulated weight of many seasons away from the structure underneath. It emerged slowly. A wall. Low, maybe 4 feet high, built from the same stone as the ridge, but fitted together with a precision that separated it clearly from the natural outcropping it was built against. And at the base of it, recessed slightly, a frame of older timber and a surface of iron plate, dark with age, sealed along the edges by decades of frost and growth, but solid, intact, made to last by someone who understood materials and time. And at the center of it, an iron ring. Nora sat back on her heels. She looked at the ring. She looked at Rex, who had stopped digging and was now simply watching her with that expression that communicated certainty without providing explanation. Her father's voice came back to her, not a memory she had called for, one that arrived on its own the way the important ones always did. Some places aren't ready for you yet. She looked at the ridge, at the trees, at the snow falling through the dark above her. She thought about the land record in her pocket, the name on it, the date. She thought about a woman building a hidden place in a forest in 1974. 7 years before Nora was born, in the mountains behind the house where she grew up, on land that had always belonged to that woman and never to the family that had spent 40 years pretending otherwise. She reached out and closed her hand around the iron ring. It was cold enough to burn even through the glove. She pulled. The resistance was enormous, decades of frost and pressure and time working against her. But the mechanism was still there, still intact under everything that had accumulated over it. And when she shifted her footing and pulled with her full weight, the thing gave not all at once, but progressively, stone grinding against stone, in a sound that was too loud for the forest, and then too quiet immediately after, like something that had been holding its breath, finally releasing it. A gap opened, dark beneath. Still air came up from it, different from the air outside, not cold in the same way, contained, preserved, like the breath of something that had been sealed away for a very long time and was only now being allowed to speak. Rex did not hesitate. He pushed his head into the gap, then his shoulders, then the rest of him, and disappeared into the dark below. Nora listened. Nothing. Then the sound of the dog moving deeper away from the entrance, his paws finding the ground below with the easy confidence of an animal who had already decided this was a safe place. She dropped to one knee and followed. The passage was narrow and low, and it required her to turn sideways in places where the stone had settled, or the timber framing had bowed slightly inward with the weight of years. She moved through it slowly, one hand on the wall, feeling the texture of it change as she went deeper from rough natural rock to work stone that someone had shaped and placed with care. The light from outside disappeared almost immediately. The temperature shifted, not warmer but less aggressive, stable. The specific temperature of something that had been insulated from variation for a very long time. The passage opened. She stepped into a space and stopped. It was not large, maybe 20 feet across at its widest, the ceiling just high enough that she could stand upright without ducking. But it was a room, a deliberate room built with intention and skill and time by someone who understood construction and who had committed to this project across what must have been many seasons of work. The walls were stacked stone fitted together with a patience that showed in every joint, each piece chosen for its shape and placed to bear weight and distribute it. The floor was bedrock with a shallow layer of packed earth over it. In the center of the space, a fire pit made from a ring of stones blackened by years of use. Along the far wall, a raised platform of layered rock, flat and wide enough to sleep on. And set into the walls, shallow shelves, each one carved or built to a different depth. Some empty, some containing things that had waited here without deteriorating. A wood pile in the corner, old but dry, preserved by the same contained air that kept everything in this space exactly as it had been left. A tin basin on one of the shelves. A folded piece of oilcloth. A coil of rope. A tin cup. The ordinary equipment of someone who had intended to survive in a specific place for an extended period and had prepared accordingly. And on the highest shelf, protected by the overhang of stone above it, a book. Not a book, a notebook. Bound in leather that had darkened with age, the corners soft and rounded from handling the kind of softness that came from many hands holding the same thing many times. Nora crossed the room and took it down carefully, turned it over in her hands. The binding was still intact. The leather had dried and tightened, but it had not cracked, had been preserved by the dry, still air that had kept everything in this room from the usual processes of deterioration. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and controlled, the kind that suggested a person who had learned to write when paper was something you did not waste, when every word had to earn its place on the page. Margaret Wren, October 1974. Below that, a date and then words that began as a record and became something else entirely as the pages turned. She read them standing there in the dark, the notebook tilted toward the narrow shaft of air that ran up through the rock above her and let in just enough of the night sky to make reading possible. The first pages were practical in the way of someone learning a new place by documenting it. Temperature readings, wind direction noted by the way sound moved through the trees above. Notes on how long the fire pit held heat after the wood burned down and what kind of wood lasted longest. Notes on water on the drip that collected in the stone basin carved into the far wall on how long the supply lasted and when it needed to be supplemented from outside. The methodical record of a woman learning how to survive in a specific place, learning it the way Nora had learned other kinds of survival by attention and repetition, and the willingness to be wrong and correct, and be wrong again until the right answer was so deeply embedded that it operated without conscious thought. Then the writing changed. He was at the house again this morning. I watched from the upper ridge. He does not know about this place. He is looking for the documents, not for me. If I can keep him looking for the wrong thing long enough, there may still be a way out of this that does not require me to leave entirely. Nora turned the page. The entries became less regular after that. Some days had multiple entries dense with observation and planning. Others had nothing, weeks passing between, some of them marked only by a date and a single line that told her Margaret was still there, still intact, still functioning under whatever pressure had caused her to build this place in the first place. Then near the back of the notebook, the handwriting changed again, becoming compressed and urgent, in the way of someone trying to get everything down before the time available for getting things down ran out. I cannot keep her here past winter. The air is too still at night. Not enough circulation. I have to make a decision before the first hard freeze, which gives me 3 weeks at most, if the weather follows what it has done the past 2 years. I have made the arrangement. He will come at the end of the week. After that, I do not know how long I can stay before I have to move. But she will be safe. That is the only thing that matters now. Nora read the pronoun 3 times. She. She held the notebook and stood very still and let the words settle into her, the way cold settled into exposed skin gradually and then all at once. She turned the next page. The entry was the shortest in the book. The handwriting pressed harder into the paper, not from anger, but from the kind of concentration that came with the things you wrote, because you were afraid of what would happen if you did not write them down. I found the man, the one she told me about before this started, the one she said would know what to do if the time came. I do not know if I trust him yet, but I am running out of time to find someone I trust more. He has the kind of silence that holds things rather than hiding them. That is the best I can hope for now. Nora closed the notebook. She held it in both hands and stood in the dark room that a woman had built inside a mountain and read the words again in her memory. She felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically the way things shifted in stories, just quietly and permanently the way a bone healed, moving from one configuration to another and staying there. Rex moved then. The dog had been working the perimeter of the room since they entered, methodical nose close to the floor, then the walls, then the floor again, the systematic assessment of a new space that he performed in every new space they entered together. Now he stopped at the far corner, the one farthest from the entrance, and most deeply shadowed by the platform, and began to dig. Not urgently, carefully, the way he dug when he had found something fragile that needed to be uncovered without damage. Nora crossed the room. The corner was partially obscured by the shadow of the platform, the kind of shadow that the eye defaulted to reading as empty space. Rex had cleared a small area of packed earth and was nosing at something beneath the surface, with the precise delicacy of an animal that understood the difference between things that could bear pressure and things that could not. Nora crouched beside him and reached into the space Rex had opened. Her fingers found something that was not stone and not wood, softer, thin and light. She worked it free carefully. A chain, tarnished silver light as a breath, the kind worn close to the skin for years until the metal carried the warmth of the body that wore it. She held it up. A pendant, small, a simple shape, a leaf stylized but organic, the kind of detail that someone had chosen because it meant something specific to them rather than because it was fashionable or expected. She turned it over. On the back, 2 letters engraved small and precise. M.W. She set the chain on her palm and looked at it for a long moment, feeling its negligible weight, thinking about the neck. It had rested against the hands that had clasped and unclasped it across whatever years it had been worn. Then Rex pushed something else toward her with his nose, something that had been beneath the chain or preserved alongside it in the same small hollow in the earth. A photograph. It was old. The edges had curled and the surface had faded from full color to something flatter and more muted, but the image was intact, preserved by the same dry air that had kept the notebook from crumbling. A young woman, mid-20s, dark hair loose and slightly disordered by wind. Her face was soft, not yet set into the harder lines that time and difficulty put on a person. She was standing in a yard, and behind her, recognizable, even in the faded image, a tree. Old apple tree, the kind that grew low and wide with decades of untended growth, its branches making the distinctive spreading silhouette that Nora had looked at from her childhood bedroom window for the first 18 years of her life. The tree in the backyard of her father's house. Nora looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at the tree, at the angle of the light which put the sun in the southwest, which meant the photograph was taken from the east side of the yard, which was the side that faced the ridge she was currently sitting under. She looked at the woman's face, at the darkness of her hair, at the softness that had not yet been replaced by something harder. The woman was holding something. Her arms were curved inward, cradled, the posture of someone holding something small and breakable and precious. But the photograph cut off at her waist, and whatever she was holding was not visible in the frame. Nora turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same controlled handwriting as the notebook. 2 lines only. November 1981. For when she's ready. Nora sat back. The notebook was beside her. The chain was in her hand. The photograph was between her fingers, and she held it carefully because it felt like the kind of thing that would not survive being held carelessly, that had survived this long precisely because it had been placed somewhere. It could not be handled carelessly. November 1981. She had been born in November 1981. She knew the month because her father had mentioned it once, a single unsolicited offering that had never been followed by anything else. She had grown up with a birthday that approximated itself, that landed somewhere in November, without certainty, celebrated on whatever day felt convenient and never discussed further. She had understood as a child that this was one of the categories of things you did not ask about. Her father had a few of those categories, and she had learned their shapes early, the way children learn the shapes of furniture in a dark room, by running into them enough times to memorize where the edges were. The mountain was very quiet around her. Rex had stopped digging. He sat beside her, now close enough that his warmth was real and present in the cold of the chamber. And he looked at the photograph in her hand with the kind of stillness that he reserved for things he had decided were important. The complete attention of an animal that had chosen to be fully present in a moment. Nora looked at the woman in the photograph, at the yard behind her, at the tree, at the arms curved around something the frame refused to show. She thought about her father, about the particular quality of his silences, which had always been different from the silences of other men. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say. The silence of someone who had decided very deliberately what not to say, and had maintained that decision across decades without once faltering. The silence of a man who believed that some truths were more dangerous than their absence, and had acted on that belief with a consistency that she was only now standing in a room built inside a mountain, beginning to understand the full cost of. Some places aren't ready for you yet. Not the ridge, not the forest. The truth. The truth had not been ready for her, or she had not been ready for it, or the person who had carried it had decided for reasons Nora was only now beginning to understand. The shape of that readiness was not something that could be rushed. She put the chain in her jacket pocket. She kept the photograph in her hand. She picked up the notebook. Rex stood. He walked to the fire pit, looked at the old wood in the corner, then looked at Nora with the expression that was not a question so much as an observation about what the situation called for next. Nora looked at the wood. Dry, preserved by the same contained air that had kept the notebook intact, the same quality of stillness that had held everything in this room, exactly as it had been left, waiting for someone to return or someone new to arrive. She reached into her jacket pocket and found the lighter she carried as a matter of habit from field medic training, always a light source, always there. She crossed to the fire pit and crouched over the old wood and held the flame to it. The wood caught slow at first, reluctant in the way of things that had been still for a very long time. And then with purpose, the flame spreading along the grain of the wood and releasing warmth into the stone chamber. Light reached the walls. The stone absorbed it and gave a little of it back the way stone always did when you gave it something. The shadows retreated to the corners and stayed there. Rex lay down beside the fire with a long exhale. His injured shoulder where he had caught a piece of falling stone near the entrance during their climb. Visible now in the light, the fur darkened where it had bled and dried. Nora cleaned the wound with a small kit she kept in her bag, the minimal field kit she had carried since her first deployment, and wrapped it with the care of someone who had bandaged wounds in conditions that made this chamber seem like a hospital. Rex held still throughout, trusting completely, his eyes watching her face rather than her hands. She sat down with her back against the wall and the notebook in her lap, and the photograph between her fingers and the chain in her pocket, and the land record folded beside it. She looked at the fire. She looked at the room that a woman had built in secret in 1974 in the mountain behind a house that she owned, and that another family had spent 40 years pretending to own. She looked at her dog who had known where to go when she had not, who had blocked the road that led away and opened the one that led here. She opened the notebook again and read from the beginning more slowly this time, reading every entry in the order it had been written. The early entries were detailed and practical, a woman documenting the process of learning a place. Then the middle entries where the fear began to enter, where the man who watched the house appeared for the first time and kept appearing. Then the later ones, shorter and more urgent, the sentences compressed by time and necessity. He was at the fence line again this morning. He is not looking for me. He is looking for the survey documents. He knows they exist. He does not know where I have put them. If he finds them before I can get them to someone who cannot be reached by people like him, everything I have done here will have been for nothing. Nora turned the page. I have found someone. Not ideal, but trustworthy in the specific way that matters most, which is that he understands why silence is sometimes the only protection available to a person. He will not ask questions I cannot answer. He will not tell anyone what he knows. These are not qualities you find easily. I have been looking for 3 months. Another page. Tomorrow. It has to be tomorrow. The window is closing. If I wait another week, the past will be too dangerous, and I will have missed this year entirely. One more winter in this place with her, and the air problems will become something I cannot manage alone. And then near the very back in the entry that had changed its handwriting into something tighter and more deliberate. If I do not come back, the dog will know. I do not mean the dog I have now. I mean whatever dog finds this place when the right person comes. Dogs have always understood things about this land that people who claim to own it never will. Trust the dog. Follow where it goes. That is the only instruction that will matter. Nora read that entry 3 times. Then she looked at Rex, who was lying beside the fire with his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and steady, the particular relaxation of an animal that had completed what it had set out to do and was allowing itself to rest. She had followed him up a mountain in the dark, in a snowstorm, on a night when she had been expelled from the only house she had ever thought of as home. She had followed him because he had closed his teeth around her sleeve with a specific signal that meant pay attention to something you are missing. She looked at the notebook in her lap, at the handwriting of a woman who had sat in this room in this cold with this mountain above her, and had written every detail down because she had understood that writing it down was the only armor that lasted. And at the end of it had written one sentence about a dog. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the mountain held its silence, and the snow fell, and everything that had been placed in motion 40 years ago continued to move toward the moment that had been prepared for it. The fire had burned down to coals by the time Nora stopped reading. She did not know what hour it was. Her watch was in her bag, and she had not reached for it because time in this place did not seem to operate the way it did outside. The light through the narrow shaft above had gone from black to something slightly less than black, the particular dark that preceded dawn without yet committing to it. Rex was still beside the coals, his breathing slow and even, one ear moving occasionally at sounds too distant or too faint for Nora to register. She set the notebook down on the stone beside her and looked at the ceiling. The stone above her was solid and patient and entirely indifferent to the things that had happened beneath it, which was the kind of quality she had always found easier to be around than the human alternative. She had read all of it, every entry, the methodical early ones with their temperature readings and wood assessments and water calculations, the record of a woman learning a place with the same thoroughness that Nora had applied to learning the places she had been sent to work in. The middle ones that tracked something tightening around Margaret Wren, like a hand closing slowly the visits to the house below. The documents she had moved and moved again, the growing compression of her options. The later ones that were shorter and more urgent, the sentences themselves becoming compressed as fear condensed everything into its essentials. She put the photograph back in her pocket. She put the chain in beside it. She kept the land record in her other pocket, the one from the envelope Sylvia had pressed into her jacket with 2 fingers, and the expression of a woman executing a plan she had prepared well in advance of the night it was needed. The document Sylvia had wanted her to sign was a waiver. Nora understood that now in a way she had not fully understood it in the lawyer's office, when it had seemed like bureaucratic aggression, unpleasant, but within the range of things people did to each other in the context of inherited property. What it actually was, what it had always been, was a firewall. Sylvia had known about Margaret Wren. She had known about the land record. She had known that the Eastern Ridge did not belong to the Calder family and had never belonged to the Calder family, and she had needed Nora to sign something that would make the question of rightful ownership irrelevant before Nora was in a position to ask it. The lighter had ignited while Sylvia was still preparing her strategy. Rex lifted his head. Both ears came forward in the way that meant something external had changed, not a sound necessarily, more a shift in pressure or quality, the kind of thing a human body registered as unease without being able to source it. Nora stood slowly and crossed to the passage in silence. She moved through it the way she had learned to move through uncertain spaces, weight forward, one hand on the wall, each step placed before the next was committed to. At the entrance, she paused and looked out through the narrow opening into the forest beyond. The snow had stopped falling at some point while she was reading. The world outside was the blue-white of very early morning, the trees standing dark against a sky that had not yet decided to become light. The snow on the ground was undisturbed in every direction she could see. But there were prints, just at the edge of her visibility, maybe 40 feet out, a single line of boot prints that came from the north and stopped. Not stopped as in turned around. Stopped as in someone had stood in one place for a period of time and then departed by a route she could not track from this angle. Someone had been standing outside the entrance during the night, not close enough to find it or not choosing to approach, just standing, watching the slope the way you watched a slope when you knew something was in it but were not yet ready to go in after it. Nora studied the prints for a long time. She measured the spacing of them, which told her stride length, which told her approximate height. She looked at the depth of them relative to the snowfall pattern, which put them at somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. She looked at the direction the toe pointed, which told her the person had been facing the entrance directly, not passing by, and pausing but arriving with intention and standing with purpose. She stepped back inside. Rex had come up behind her silently and stood close. She put her hand on the dog's neck briefly. Not a threat. Not yet. But not nothing. Someone knew or suspected or had been sent to find out. She sat down beside the cold fire pit and did not sleep. The light came gradually, the way Vermont light came in December, reluctantly and without warmth, seeping through the shaft above in degrees, until the room was gray and then pale, and then something that approximated visible. Rex stayed close. His shoulder had stiffened overnight, and he moved it carefully, the precise self-awareness of an animal that understood its own body and managed it accordingly. Nora took the last of the food from her bag, a protein bar and half a water bottle. She ate half the bar and gave the other half to Rex, who accepted it without ceremony and ate it in 2 efficient bites. She drank half the water and offered the rest to Rex from her cup palm, which Rex drank with the same economy they had developed together across years of sharing resources in situations where resources were limited. Then the wind changed. Not the wind inside the chamber, The quality of the air, the pressure of it, the subtle shift that anyone who had spent significant time outdoors learned to recognize as a warning before the sky made it official. Nora had felt it before in other places in conditions where the sky's intentions had direct consequences for the people standing under it. Rex felt it too. He was on his feet before Nora stood facing the entrance, with his whole body, the injury in his shoulder apparently secondary to whatever his instincts were telling him about what was coming. Nora packed her bag quickly and without panic, the way she did most things, with the compressed efficiency of someone who had learned that panic borrowed time from the moments that needed it most. The notebook she placed in the bag with particular care wrapped in the oilcloth from the shelf. The photograph was in her jacket pocket. The chain was in her jacket pocket. The land record was in her jacket pocket. She was ready when the first gust hit. It did not announce itself. It arrived slamming into the mountain with a force that came through even the stone and the earth above them, dropping the temperature in the shaft immediately and sending a thin needle of wind through the entrance passage that was sharp enough to sting. Rex was already at the passage. Nora followed him out. The forest had transformed. The sky had dropped and the snow was coming horizontally, not falling, but driven the kind of storm that turned the air itself into a solid thing that pushed back when you tried to move through it. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet in any direction, the trees beyond that dissolving into white. The temperature had fallen hard and fast the way it fell in the mountains when the storm came from the northwest and had nothing to slow it down. Nora stood at the entrance and listened. Under the wind, under the snow and the creak of the trees and the dense layered sound of a serious storm, there was something else. She had learned to hear underneath the obvious noise. It was part of what had kept her functional in places where the obvious noise was designed to cover something more dangerous. It was faint, directional, coming from the northeast, which was upslope from where they were, where the terrain steepened before it leveled into the plateau above the ridge. A voice, or what remained of a voice after cold and wind and time had worked on it. Rex turned northeast. His body said everything his voice could not. Nora made the calculation in the time it took to take one breath. The temperature, the visibility, the wind speed, the distance and the terrain, and the probability that whoever was out there in this had been out there long enough that the margins were already closing. She moved. The storm hit her fully the moment she stepped clear of the tree cover. The wind was a wall, pulsing and surging harder, and she moved through it by reading the rhythm of it, advancing in the drops. Rex was ahead, a dark shape in the white moving, with a certainty that told her he had a signal he was following. They found the first survivor 15 minutes in. She was in a slight depression where the snow had drifted and partially buried her, which had probably saved her core temperature. She was curled on her side, facing into the slope, her back to the wind, which was also correct instinct. Dark hair frozen at the ends, face pale in the specific way of someone whose body had started pulling blood away from the extremities to protect what mattered most. Her breathing was shallow but audible even in the storm. Nora dropped to her knees beside her. She brushed the snow from her face and checked her airway and her pulse, which was slow but present. She was in her mid-30s, lean and weathered in the way of someone who spent significant time outside voluntarily. A camera bag was strapped across her body, still buckled, which told Nora she had held on to it even after she stopped being able to move effectively, which told her something about the woman's priorities. Her eyes opened. They focused faster than Nora expected. She looked at her for exactly 1 second before she spoke. The other, she said. Her voice was a ruin barely there. Nora looked at Rex. The dog had already turned and was moving again. She pulled the woman upright, carefully got her arm across her shoulders and followed. The child was 50 yards further upslope. She was small, 7 or 8 years old, blonde hair visible beneath a knit cap. She was in the lee of a fallen pine that had created a natural windbreak, which was either luck or someone had placed her there deliberately and given the woman's condition. When Nora had found her, she suspected the latter. The child was unconscious but breathing, and her color was better than the woman's had been. Nora adjusted her hold on the woman and crouched beside the child and lifted her with her other arm. She was not heavy. She had carried children before in conditions that were different in character but not in the mathematics of them. Rex moved ahead. The young man was another 40 yards on, lying on his side, with one leg bent at an angle that told the story immediately. He was conscious. Early 20s, the look of someone functioning on determination longer than determination was designed to sustain. "Can you move?" Nora said. "Leg," he said. She assessed it quickly. Not catastrophically broken, but enough. She set the child down in the shelter of a tree root and looked at Rex. The dog moved to the child and stood over her. The specific configuration of an animal that had assigned itself a task. Nora got the young man upright. They found the configuration that worked. She deposited him at the base of the tree with the child and went back for the woman who had remained upright where she had left her by the stubbornness of someone who had decided she was not going to stop. Then there were two more. The older man was perhaps 70, gray-bearded, and very thin. He was sitting against a rock with his eyes closed, and for one moment the stillness was total enough to be alarming. But then he exhaled and opened his eyes and looked at Nora with the mild confusion of someone who had been somewhere else and been retrieved. Then the last one. He was standing, leaning against a pine with one shoulder, his weight distributed in the careful way of a man who was managing a situation rather than succumbing to it. Late 40s perhaps, pushing 50, with dark hair gone gray at the temples, and a face that had been shaped by years of something that had not been easy. His eyes were open and clear in a way that was incongruous with everything else about the situation. He looked at Nora when she reached him, not with surprise, with the expression of a man who had been expecting something and was now determining whether what had arrived matched what he had anticipated. Then he looked at Rex. Something crossed his face. Not recognition exactly, something more complex. The expression of a man encountering confirmation of something he had long suspected. His knees went then, and Nora caught him. "You," the man said. His voice was low and wrecked from the cold. Nora said nothing. She got his arm across her shoulders and started back. The return was the worst part. It always was. On the way out, there was purpose and direction, and the energy that came from moving towards something. On the way back, there was only the weight of what you had found, and the distance between you and where you needed to be, and the storm did not care about any of it. She made 2 trips. Rex shepherded the ones who could move partially under their own power. Nora carried the ones who could not. Inside the chamber, the temperature difference was immediate. The storm's violence stopped at the entrance, as if it had been given a boundary it chose to respect. The cold inside was real, but still, in stillness, at the temperatures they had all been exposed to, felt almost warm. Nora moved fast, fire first. She had a backup lighter at the bottom of her bag. The old wood caught as it had the night before. She arranged the group around the fire pit in order of assessed priority. The child closest, then the older man, then the woman with the camera bag, then the young man with the broken leg, who propped himself against the wall with the grim practicality of someone who understood his situation. The man with the gray temples sat apart slightly, his back against the far wall, watching everything. Nora worked through each of them. Temperature, pulse, airways, extremities. She had no kit beyond the minimal supplies in her bag, but her hands knew what to look for, and her mind knew what it meant. The child came around to consciousness within 20 minutes of the fire establishing itself, blinking up at the stone ceiling with an expression that was more curious than frightened, which told Nora something about her. The young man's leg would need real attention, but was not immediately life-threatening. The older man's pulse was thin but steady, and the fire was doing its work. The woman opened her eyes fully about 30 minutes in. She sat up with a precision that said she had been conscious for longer than she had let on. She looked at Nora, at Rex, who was moving between the group members in his quiet loops, at the room around her, at the notebook on the ledge where Nora had placed it when she came back in. Her eyes stopped on the notebook. "Delia Forsyth," she said. Her voice was coming back. She checked the camera bag automatically. The man with the gray temples spoke before she could continue. "You found it," he said. He was looking at the notebook. Nora turned to him. His gaze moved from the notebook to Nora slowly, the way a gaze moved when the mind was deciding how much to say and in what order. "Calvin Marsh," he said. Nora waited. Calvin looked at Rex. The dog had stopped his circuit and was sitting near the fire watching Calvin with the calm attention he gave to things he had decided were worth monitoring. "Your father brought me here once," Calvin said. His voice was low and measured, the voice of a man who had held something for a long time and had decided the time for holding it was over. "The night before he took you away." The fire cracked. The storm continued outside, indifferent and complete. Nora looked at Calvin Marsh across the firelit space. She did not speak. She had learned that silence created a space that people who needed to say things eventually filled, and Calvin Marsh was a man who needed to say something. Calvin reached forward and took the notebook from the ledge. He held its spine up, feeling its construction rather than reading its contents. His fingers moved along the inside of the back cover, pressing steadily, testing. Nora watched. Calvin's fingers stopped. He pressed once firmly in a specific spot near the bottom corner of the back cover. Then he worked the edge of the lining with a thumbnail, careful and precise, the motion of a man who had been told what was here and had been waiting for the moment to retrieve it. The inner lining separated, not tearing, peeling away from an adhesive that age had weakened to exactly this point. From the space between the cover and the lining, Calvin removed a folded piece of paper, thin, the kind of thin that meant age and careful preservation. He held it out to Nora. She took it. She unfolded it slowly, the paper resisting the movement at the creases, then relenting. The handwriting inside was the same as the notebook. Small, controlled, pressed into the paper with the particular care of someone who understood this was the last version of this that would be written, that there would not be an opportunity to revise it. "If you are reading this, you survived. I prayed for this every day. I want you to know that." Nora's chest tightened. She kept reading. "I could not keep you with me. The man who was watching the house knew what I had, and he knew that eventually I would try to use it against his family because that is what I intended to do. And men like that can read intentions the way the rest of us read words. Keeping you close would have been keeping you in the path of something I could not stop. So I did not keep you close. I gave you to the only man I trusted enough to disappear with you, to take you somewhere they would not look, to raise you in the silence. That was the only thing I could offer you instead of safety." Nora looked at the fire. Then she looked at the paper again. "Your father, not by blood, but by choice. She will not explain. She will not tell you the things that I am telling you now, not because she does not know them, but because she understands what knowing them too early would cost you. Her silence was never absence. It was armor. The land is yours. It has always been yours. It was mine first, and now it is yours. And the only reason anyone has ever treated it as though it belonged to someone else is because I was not able to stay and defend what I had documented. The documents are with Mabel Quinn in Burlington. They have always been with Mabel Quinn. She has been waiting for 40 years. The Calder family has known this. They have known since the year after I left that the Eastern Ridge was not theirs and could never legally be made theirs. They have been hoping the documentation would be lost or that no rightful heir would emerge to present it. That is why they needed your signature tonight before you were in a position to understand what you were signing. Go to Mabel Quinn. Show her this letter. The rest will follow." Nora folded the letter. She put it in her jacket pocket with the photograph and the chain and the land record. She looked at Calvin Marsh. Calvin was watching her with the expression of a man who had delivered something heavy and was now waiting to see if the recipient's hands were strong enough to hold it. "You knew," Nora said. Calvin nodded. "All of it." "Not all of it," he said. "Enough of it. Your father told me enough the night she came to get you. She did not tell me everything because she understood that information was a liability in the same way Margaret understood it. She told me enough so that if you ever came back, if you ever found this place, I would know to tell you the rest. And she told me to check whether you had found the bag." Nora looked at him. "The bag," Calvin said. "Check the lining. Your father was not a woman who left things to chance. Delia Forsyth was watching both of them with the complete stillness of someone doing exactly what her instincts told her to do, which was to be present and quiet and absorb everything being said. She spoke now. "Margaret Wren," she said. It was not a question. Both of them looked at her. "I've been looking at that case for 2 years," Delia said. "Vermont State Archives County Land Records, the disappeared persons filings from 1982. Margaret Wren, she was listed as voluntarily missing, which meant no active investigation. But the land records were irregular. The parcel on the eastern ridge had been recorded in her name in 1968, and there was no subsequent transfer, no sale, no probate, nothing. It was just sitting there in the record with a living owner who had no known address. Who was she hiding from? Nora said. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said the Calder family has logged the eastern ridge since 1984. The old-growth timber on it has been worth considerably more than the property was ever assessed for. The man who first came to Margaret's house and stood outside it and watched it in 1981 was the grandfather of the man who currently holds the timber permits. Warwick's grandfather, Nora said. Calvin nodded. His name was Aldous Calder. He died in 1997. But the business arrangement he established continued. The family knew the land was not theirs to log. They logged it anyway because no one who could prove otherwise was present to object. They have been filing tax assessments on timber they did not own for 40 years. The fire settled lower. Nora added the last of the dry wood from the corner. "What's in the documents with Mabel Quinn?" Delia said. "The original land deed," Calvin said. "The recorded survey from 1968. And a filed declaration of intent to transfer dated November 1981, naming Nora as the sole heir to the parcel. Signed and notarized before Margaret disappeared. Mabel Quinn notarized it herself and has held the file since the day Margaret handed it to her." Nora looked at the letter in her pocket. November 1981. The same month as the photograph. The same month as her birth. "She set it all up before she left," Delia said. She was not asking. "She set it all up," Calvin said. "The hiding, the documents, the letter in the notebook. She planned for every contingency she could imagine except one. What Nora said." Calvin looked at her. "She planned for you to come back. She did not plan for it to take this long, and she did not plan to not be here when you did." He paused. "She left this place in the spring of 1982 and went somewhere they would not look. As far as I know, she is still alive, but I do not know where." Nora let that settle. Her mother had not died. Her mother had disappeared on purpose and stayed disappeared for 40 years because disappearing was the only option that kept both of them alive. The storm was still going outside. She could feel it through the stone. Rex lay down beside her. He pressed his warm flank against her leg and exhaled slowly. Nora put her hand on the dog's back. One dog, on one driveway, on one night. She closed her hand around the letter in her pocket and held it there, and the fire burned, and the storm worked against the mountain and could not find a way in. The storm broke before dawn. Not gently. It simply stopped. The way a held breath stopped all at once and completely leaving a silence so sudden and total that it woke Nora from the half-sleep she had finally allowed herself in the last hour. She lay still for a moment with her eyes open, listening to the absence of the wind, feeling it in the way the mountain around her had settled from vibration into stillness. Rex was already awake, sitting at the entrance to the passage, facing outward, his ears forward. Nora sat up. She checked the group. The child was still sleeping her color good. The older man was breathing steadily. The young man with the broken leg was awake, sitting against the wall with his jaw set. Delia Forsyth was sitting cross-legged near the dying fire, with her notebook open, writing with the focused economy of someone who had learned to capture things quickly before they shifted. Calvin Marsh was awake. He was sitting exactly where he had been sitting when she had last looked at him before closing her eyes. She was not certain he had slept at all. Outside, the light was beginning to come through the shaft, pale and tentative. At first, then, with the particular quality of post-storm morning, everything washed and bright. She stood and went to the entrance and looked out. The forest was transformed. Snow had reorganized the landscape entirely, filling the hollows, rounding every surface, loading the branches. The air was absolutely still and very cold. The sky above the trees was the definitive clear of a sky that had decided. She stood in the entrance for a long time. She could hear it already if she listened past the stillness, the faint mechanical sound of engines in the valley. She went back inside. They will come up from the valley road, Calvin said. Search and rescue has a staging area at the Mercer farm 3 miles south. They would have mobilized during the storm. Nora looked at the group, assessing. She looked at the shaft above the fire pit. Green wood, she said. She had already understood. Calvin nodded. She brought green branches in from the growth near the entrance, damp from the storm. She built the fire higher and added the green wood and watched the smoke thicken and darken and rise through the shaft in a column that would above the tree line be visible from the valley against the clear sky. It took 40 minutes. Rex heard them well before Nora did. He stood at the entrance with his tail moving for the first time since they had come in from the storm. The rescue team came in 3 at first, then more. They moved to the injured immediately with the practiced efficiency of people who train for this. The child was assessed and declared cold but intact. The young man's leg was splinted. The older man was helped to his feet and guided toward the passage. Calvin stood last. He was moving stiffly. He looked at the room one more time, at the fire pit, at the shelves, at the notebook on the ledge which Nora had placed back there while the rescuers worked because it belonged there. Then he looked at Nora directly. The bag, he said. Check the lining. She would not have sent you here with only what she said out loud. Then he turned and followed the others through the passage. Nora stood alone in the chamber with Rex. The fire was still going. One rescue team member waited at the entrance. The sounds of the larger group moving back down the slope were already fading. Nora looked at the bag on the floor. It was a military surplus duffel, old, the canvas worn soft from years of use. She had carried it since she was 19. She knew every pocket of it, every seam, every place where the stitching had been repaired. She had not known about the lining. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. She pressed along the base of it the way Calvin had pressed along the base of the notebook cover. The canvas was thick and stiff, but there was a difference in the density at the bottom, something layered inside the structure of the bag. She found the inner seam, a secondary stitching that ran along the interior bottom panel in a slightly different thread, the color of a repair rather than original construction. Her father had been careful with her hands, had been the kind of woman who could alter a stitch and make it look almost like the original if you were not looking for the difference. Nora was looking. She opened the seam with her pocket knife. The outer layer of canvas separated from an inner layer. Between them, folded flat and sealed inside a piece of oilcloth identical to the piece that had been on the shelf in this room, was a sheet of paper, and beneath it, flat and thin, a folded document. The document first, she unfolded it. A map, hand-drawn on drafting paper, the lines made with a ruling pen rather than a freehand instrument. The detail was extraordinary. She recognized the terrain immediately, the shape of the ridge, the property lines of the valley below the road, the house, the eastern slope. The map extended further than the immediate property in every direction, showing the full extent of the parcel, the survey markers, the boundary coordinates. In the margin, a parcel number that matched the parcel number on the land record from Sylvia's envelope exactly. And in the lower right corner, in her father's handwriting, an address. Mabel Quinn, 14 Ridgeline Street, Burlington, Vermont. And below it, one line. If you find this place, I kept my promise to your mother. Nora held the map for a long time without moving. Then she opened the letter. It was short. Her father had never been a woman of many words, and she had not become one in writing. The handwriting was the same as on every birthday card Nora had ever received, on the few letters that had arrived during deployments, on the note that had been taped to the refrigerator when Nora came home from her first tour to find the house empty and a casserole inside, and her father's explanation of where she had gone and when she would be back. She read it. I am not good at the things people are supposed to say. You know this. I never learned the language of it, and I am too old to learn it now. But I want you to know one thing before I am not able to say it anymore. What I did because she asked me to. What I kept because she needed me to. But I would have done it anyway. I would have done all of it without being asked, because from the first night you were in this house, I understood that you were supposed to be here, and I was supposed to be the one who kept you safe in it. That is not a debt. That is not an obligation. That is just what happened, and I am not sorry for a single day of it. Go see Mabel Quinn. She has been waiting longer than either of us. Nora folded the letter. She put it in her jacket pocket with the other letter and the photograph, in the chain, in the land record. Her pockets were full, now full of the things that the people who loved her had spent 40 years assembling for this specific moment. She picked up the notebook from the ledge. She wrapped it in the oilcloth from the shelf. She put it in the bag. Then she looked at the room one more time. The fire low, the shelves, the platform, the shaft, the basin. All of it exactly as it had been left, waiting with the patience of stone for whatever came next. Rex came to stand beside her. Nora adjusted the bag on her shoulder, put her hand on the dog's head briefly, and went through the passage. Outside, the morning was full of light. The trees stood in their new weight of snow. The air was cold in the clean, resolved way of winter air that knew exactly what it was. She followed the tracks of the rescue team down the slope. They were loading the last of the stretchers into the vehicles when she came out of the tree line. The staging area was organized movement, people with purpose. Rex came out of the trees beside her. Delia Forsyth was sitting on the rear bumper of one of the vehicles, wrapped in a thermal blanket, her notebook open again. She looked up when she saw Nora and watched her cross the distance with the assessing look that seemed to be her natural state. Nora sat down on the bumper beside her. The documents with Mabel Quinn, Nora said. If what Calvin described is accurate in terms of the timber operations since 1984, what is the legal exposure for the Calder family? Delia was quiet for a moment. 40 years of timber extraction from a parcel they did not own, she said. At commercial rates for old-growth, Vermont hardwood, factoring current land values and restitution assessments for unauthorized extraction from privately held land. She paused. Hundreds of thousands of dollars at minimum, possibly significantly more, depending on what the timber records show. And the environmental assessment on top of that, if the logging violated watershed protection ordinances, which, given the topography of the eastern ridge, it almost certainly did. Nora looked at the tree line. More than the estate is worth, she said. Significantly more, Delia said. She paused again. The signature Sylvia wanted from you. If you had signed it, it would have constituted a waiver of any claim I had to the parcel, Nora said, which would have made challenging their use of it legally complicated, even if I later established standing as Margaret's heir. Delia nodded. She already knew this. She was confirming that Nora knew it. She knew from the beginning, Nora said. This was not a precaution, it was the plan. Delia looked at her. The waiver was prepared before the reading of the will. The land record copy inside the envelope was prepared before the reading of the will. She wanted you to see it, see the name on it, and sign the waiver in the same motion before you had time to understand the connection between the two things. Nora was quiet. She did not know about the notebook, Delia said. She did not know about this place. If she had known, she would not have let you leave that house last night. She would have found another way to keep you occupied until you signed. Rex settled at Nora's feet in the snow. Nora thought about the driveway, the dark and the cold and the snow falling, and Rex standing in front of her with his teeth closed gently around the cuff of her sleeve. One gesture, one refusal. She thought about how close the margin had been. The sound of a vehicle changed behind her. She turned. A rental car had pulled into the staging area from the valley road. It parked at the edge of the organized activity and sat for a moment, engine running. Then the doors opened. Warwick got out first. He was wearing the wrong coat for the weather. He looked older than he had looked in the lawyer's office, which was only 12 hours ago and felt like considerably longer. His gray-brown hair was unkempt. He had not slept. Sylvia got out of the passenger side. She had the right coat. She had the right everything assembled and controlled the presentation maintained regardless of the circumstances. She looked at the rescue vehicles and performed the assessment she was apparently always performing. Then she looked at the tree line. Then she looked at Nora. She crossed the distance between the car and the bumper where Nora was sitting with the steady pace of a woman who had decided how this conversation would go and was proceeding toward it. Warwick followed less certainly a few steps behind and to the side. Sylvia stopped in front of Nora. She looked at Rex briefly. Rex looked at her with the mild and complete attention he gave to everything, and nothing shifted in his expression. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and removed the waiver. The same document from the night before, folded precisely. She held it out. Nora looked at it. She did not take it. Sylvia's hand remained extended. The document was steady. "This resolves everything cleanly," she said. Her voice was what it always was, even controlled. "There are costs to contesting in a state of this complexity. There are delays. There is the matter of establishing standing as a biological heir after 4 decades of no legal documentation of the relationship." She paused. "This is the simpler path." Nora looked at her face. The ones that were performing certainty and the ones that possessed it had a different quality, and she had learned to tell the difference. Sylvia was performing it. She knew something had happened on the ridge last night. She did not know what. She was proceeding on the assumption that Nora was still in the position she had been in when she walked out of the house. Nora reached into her jacket pocket. She removed the land record, the copy from Sylvia's own envelope. She unfolded it and held it so Sylvia could see it clearly. Margaret Wren's name, the parcel number, the date of original filing. Then she removed the map, her father's hand-drawn survey, the one that had been sewn into the lining of her bag. She held it beside the land record. The parcel numbers matched. The boundary coordinates matched. Then she removed Margaret's letter. She did not open it. She showed Sylvia that it existed, that it was in her hand, written in the handwriting, that any document examiner would match to the handwriting in the notebook that was currently in her bag. Sylvia looked at the documents. Her hand with the waiver remained extended for 2 more seconds. Then it lowered. The waiver returned to her coat pocket. Nothing in her face moved. She simply recalibrated and moved to the next position. She looked at Nora. The expression she gave her was not anger, and it was not defeat. It was the expression of someone filing away information for future use. "You'll want to contact an attorney," she said. "There will be a process." Nora looked at her. "Yes," she said. "There will be." Sylvia held her gaze for another moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the car with the same pace she had crossed with unhurried control. Warwick had not moved. He was standing in the same position he had taken when Sylvia stopped slightly behind and to the side, and he had watched the exchange with the expression he had been wearing since the lawyer's office. He looked at Nora now, really looked, which was something he had been avoiding not just the night before, but across the larger distance of their lives. "She sent someone up there last night," Warwick said quietly. His voice was different from Sylvia's. Unsteady, but not performing unsteadiness. Real. "To see if you had found anything." "I didn't know until this morning." Nora looked at him. She thought about the boot prints outside the entrance, the precise line of them, stopping at the slope and standing for a long time, and then departing. That was what Sylvia had been doing while Nora was inside reading by firelight, covering the contingency she had not prepared for. "I didn't know," Warwick said. "About the land? About any of it. Dad said it was not our land and we should stay off it. He said it like it was settled, like the conversation was over before it started. I thought it was an easement issue, something about county access." Eli said nothing. Warwick swallowed. "Dad never said anything about the ridge. He said it was not our land and we should stay off it. That was all. I thought it was an easement issue, something about county access. I didn't know what was under it." Nora said nothing. Warwick looked at the tree line, at the ridge above it, at the sky above that, which was still the hard, clear blue of post-storm morning. She knew, Warwick said, he was not talking about the ridge. He was talking about something else, the specific she that lived at the center of everything that had been decided in that house across the years of his adult life. And Nora understood that this was as close as Warwick was going to come to naming it. Nora looked at her brother, half-brother. The distinction had never mattered when they were children, and she was not going to make it matter now. Not because the truth was unclear, but because the truth included the fact that Warwick had sat beside her at the same table and eaten the same canned soup and run across the same fields, and there was something in that which no document could revise. "I know," she said. Warwick looked at her. Something in his posture changed the particular change that happened when a person had been holding something at a specific angle for a long time and was finally allowed to set it down. He nodded once. Then he walked back to the car. Sylvia was already inside. The engine was still running. Nora watched the car pull out and drive south until it was gone. Delia had not moved from the bumper. "You should call a property attorney today," she said. "Not tomorrow." "I know," Nora said. "I know one in Burlington," Delia said. "Good one. He takes cases involving timber extraction irregularities because they are winnable." She paused. "I also intend to write about this." She said it directly. Margaret Wren's disappearance as it connects to the Calder family's land use history. "I will not publish anything that compromises your legal case, but the story should be told." Nora looked at her. She thought about Margaret Wren building a room inside a mountain, writing every detail down in a small, controlled hand, planning for every contingency she could imagine, hiding the most important things in the places least likely to be found. A woman who had understood that documentation was the only armor that lasted. She would want the story told, Nora said. Delia nodded. "I thought so." Calvin Marsh was being helped into a medical vehicle. He was moving slowly. As the door closed, he looked through the window at Nora. He raised one hand, not a wave exactly, the gesture of a man completing a delivery he had carried for a very long time. Nora raised her hand in return. She sat on the bumper and watched the staging area empty. Rex was still at her feet. The mountain rose above her, the ridge visible, the tree line dark against the bright sky. She would go to Burlington tomorrow. She would see Mabel Quinn. She would begin the process that Sylvia had correctly described as complex. But not today. Today she went back to the house. She walked the valley road because the road was clear and she was not in a hurry. Rex walked beside her at her left, close enough that their movement was synchronized in the way that came from 6 years of walking together in many different places. The house looked the same from the road. The porch light was still on. It had probably been on all night. She went in through the back door. The kitchen was empty. Warwick and Sylvia had taken nothing with them. The coffee cup was still on the counter. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Her father's cup, chipped at the rim, worn smooth on the handle, from years of the same hand holding it the same way. The dried ring of coffee around the inside, waiting for the thing that came next. She picked it up. She carried it to the sink and washed it carefully the way her father had taught her to wash things with attention, as if the object mattered. She set it on the drying rack. Then she went to the back door and stood in the doorway, looking up at the ridge. The eastern slope was in full sun now. From here she could not see the entrance, could not see the stone structure, could not see any evidence of what was up there. It looked like forest. Rex came and stood beside her in the doorway. Nora thought about the notebook, about the precision of the handwriting and the patience of the plans, and the woman who had built a room inside a mountain and written everything down. She thought about her father's map drawn with a ruling pen, every boundary recorded, sewn into the lining of a bag and carried for years. She thought about Mabel Quinn in Burlington, sitting on something for 40 years, waiting for the person she had prepared it for to arrive. She thought about the letter. "I kept my promise to your mother." Her father had been a woman who did not speak the language of the things people were supposed to say, who had written exactly one letter a month for every month of every deployment. Plain letters describing weather and the condition of the apple tree and what the neighbor's dog had done to the garden. Letters that never once said anything directly, but that arrived without fail on the first of every month, regardless of what was happening in the world. That was the language. She simply had not known how to read it. Rex stepped off the porch into the snow. He walked to the edge of the yard, stopped and looked back at Nora. She looked at the dog, then she looked at the ridge, then at the yard at the apple tree standing in the middle of it, bare and old and wide. She stepped off the porch. Rex turned and began walking across the yard through the new snow toward the apple tree. His pace was easy, not purposeful in the urgent way of the night before, just moving the way you moved when there was nowhere urgent to be, and moving itself was the point. Nora followed him across the yard. The snow came up over her boots with each step. The cold was real and clean. The sky above the ridge was the specific blue of a Vermont winter morning, after a storm, the color that only existed in that combination of latitude and season and post-storm clarity. She reached the tree. She put her hand on the bark. It was rough and cold and real under her palm. She stood there. Rex sat beside her in the snow. His dark eyes moved across the yard, across the house, up to the ridge, and back, the steady, unhurried assessment that was simply how he existed in the world. The next day, Nora drove to Burlington. The city was a different kind of cold than the ridge. Managed cold, organized by roads and buildings, the cold of somewhere that expected people and had made accommodations. She parked on Ridgeline Street and sat for a moment with Rex in the back seat, looking at the building in front of her. Number 14 was a narrow townhouse converted to office use, the kind of building that had been professional space for so long it had forgotten it was ever anything else. A small brass plate beside the door read, "Quinn Law established 1979. The plate was polished recently enough that she could see her own reflection in it. She got out. Rex came with her. The door opened into a small reception area that smelled like paper and old wood, and something that might have been cedar. A woman in her 60s looked up from a desk. Nora gave her name. The woman picked up a phone receiver, spoke quietly, set it down. "She's been expecting you," the woman said. She said it simply, without surprise, as if this were a routine appointment that had been on the calendar for some time. The inner office was small and very organized. Books on 3 walls, floor to ceiling, the kind of organizational system that only made sense to the person who had built it over many years. A desk that had been used hard for a long time. And behind the desk, a woman who was 78 years old, or perhaps older, with white hair cut short and very direct gray eyes, and the specific quality of a person who had been waiting for something for so long that the waiting had become simply part of how she moved through her days. She looked at Nora when she came in. Then she looked at Rex. Then she looked at Nora again. She stood slowly with the deliberate movement of someone managing joints that had their own opinions about rapid changes in position. She came around the desk and she did not offer a hand to shake. She put both of her hands around Nora's and held them for a moment. Her hands were dry and strong, and they held on with a steadiness that was not performed. "I've been expecting someone named Calder for a long time," she said. Her voice was low and even, shaped by decades of precision. "I just didn't know which generation." Nora looked at her. "You knew, Margaret," Nora said. Mabel Quinn released her hands and went back around the desk. She sat down and folded her hands on the surface and looked at Nora with the directness of a woman who had never found indirection useful. "I knew her well enough to understand what she was asking me to do," Mabel said, "and I understood why she was asking it. She came to me in October of 1981. She had been to 3 other attorneys in Vermont before she came to me, and each of them had told her that what she was proposing was unnecessary and that she should simply register the property transfer through normal channels." "What did you tell her?" Nora said. "I told her that normal channels were exactly what people used when they wanted other people to know what they were doing," Mabel said, "and that if she was asking me rather than using normal channels, she had a reason." She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and removed a file that was thick with documents that had been organized decades ago and maintained with the kind of attention that reflected genuine care rather than institutional obligation. She set it on the desk. "The original survey registered 1968, she said. Margaret commissioned it herself from a licensed surveyor and registered it with the county. She knew enough about how land could be taken to understand that documentation was the only protection that held." She opened the file. The deed in her name uncontested. The declaration of intent to transfer dated November 14th, 1981. Nora looked at the date. She came to me 3 days after you were born, Mabel said quietly. She had made the arrangement with your father 2 weeks before. She knew what she was going to do. She needed the paperwork to exist before she did it, so that when it was over, there would be something that could not be taken back. Nora looked at the file on the desk. At the documents that had been sitting in this office since 1981, in the bottom drawer of a desk belonging to a woman who had opened her practice in 1979 and had never once considered closing it, waiting for the person they had been prepared for. She came once more, Mabel said. In March of 1982, she said it was time to go. She said she didn't know where yet, just that it had to be somewhere they wouldn't look for her, and that she planned to keep it that way. She asked me to hold the file until the right person came. How will I know them? Nora said, repeating the question she suspected that Mabel had asked at the time. Mabel smiled. It was small and precise, the smile of someone who had held a private answer for a very long time. She told me they would have a dog, Mabel said, and that the dog would be the kind that knew where to go. Rex, who had been sitting at Nora's left throughout the conversation, in the specific upright stillness of his professional posture, turned his head toward Mabel Quinn at the sound of the word and then turned it back toward the file on the desk. Nora looked at the file, at the documents that represented a life's work of protection assembled by a woman she had never met against circumstances that would have broken a person who had not understood clearly what needed to be done and done it before the opportunity closed. She thought about the notebook, about Margaret sitting in the chamber above her father's house, writing temperature readings and wood assessments, learning the place the way you learned a place you intended to use, and then later writing the other things, the things about the man who watched the house, about the time running out, about the arrangement that had to be made. About the dog we'll know. Mabel slid the file across the desk. This is yours, she said. It always was. Nora put her hand on the file. It was not heavy. It was considerably less heavy than everything it represented. She had found that to be generally true about the things that mattered most. They were rarely heavy in themselves. The weight was in what surrounded them. She looked at Mabel Quinn. Is she alive? Nora said. Mabel was quiet for a moment. She looked at the file, then at Rex, then at Nora. I received a letter, she said, in 2019. No return address. Postmarked from a town in Oregon that I found on a map later. 3 sentences. She said she thought about Vermont every November. She said she hoped the person the file was for had found their way here. She said she hoped the dog had known. Nora sat with that. Outside, the Burlington winter pressed against the office windows. Inside, the small room that smelled like paper and cedar and decades of careful work. Mabel Quinn waited without hurrying the way she had been waiting for 40 years, and Rex sat at Nora's left with his dark eyes moving between the file on the desk and the face of the woman across it. Oregon, Nora said finally. Nora said. Mabel nodded. She said it with the care of someone releasing a thing that had been held for a long time. It is a large state, but it is a start if you want one. Nora picked up the file. They drove back to the ridge in the late afternoon, arriving when the light was going sideways through the trees and turning everything it touched the specific gold of winter light at low angles. She parked in the driveway of the house that had always been the house she grew up in, regardless of what any document said about whose name was on it, and she sat for a moment looking at the eastern slope. The ridge was dark against the sky. From here, she could see nothing of what was on it. It looked exactly as it had always looked, as it had looked when she was a child, standing at the edge of the yard in her rubber boots, looking up at it, and hearing her father say, "Some places aren't ready for you yet." She got out of the car. Rex came with her. She went into the house through the back door. The kitchen was quiet. Warwick and Sylvia had come back while she was in Burlington and taken some things she could tell by the small absences, a lamp that had been on the side table, a box of photographs from the shelf. They had not taken anything that was not clearly theirs, which she filed away as information. The coffee cup was on the drying rack where she had left it. She filled the kettle and put it on the stove. While it heated, she sat at the kitchen table with the file from Mabel Quinn open in front of her, and the notebook from the chamber beside it, and the photograph, and the chain, and the map arranged in the order they had come to her. The survey from 1968, the deed in Margaret Wren's name. The declaration of transfer dated November 14th, 1981, 3 days after Nora was born, with Mabel Quinn's notary seal still crisp on the paper despite the years. And at the back of the file, something Mabel had not mentioned. A single sheet folded once with a different kind of handwriting than the others. Not the controlled small script of the notebook. Something looser, written faster, written by someone who was running out of time. Nora unfolded it. If you are reading this at Mabel's desk, then you have already done more than I dared to hope. You have survived. You have found your way back. And there is one more thing I want you to know. One thing that I was not able to put in the letter in the notebook because I did not want to risk it being found by the wrong hands before it reached the right ones. I have been watching. Not literally, not always, but in the ways that are available to a person who cannot be present. I have followed what I could follow from a distance. I know about Fort Drum. I know about the 3 tours. I know about the dog because Mabel wrote to me when she heard about the service dog program at the base, and I asked her to let me know if anything relevant came from it. When she wrote to me in 2018 to tell me the information she had received about a specific medic and a specific German Shepherd assigned together, I knew. I have been waiting since then. There is a phone number at the bottom of this letter. It is a cell phone. It is registered to a name that is not mine as a precaution, because old habits of caution do not dissolve simply because the threat that created them has been reduced. The man who stood outside my house in 1981 has been dead since 1997, but his family has not, and I have not survived 40 years of care by becoming careless. If you want to call, I will answer. If you do not, I will understand that too. You owe me nothing. I made my choice in 1981 because it was the right choice, and because I loved you more than I loved my own presence in your life, and that has never changed, and it does not come with conditions. But I would very much like to hear your voice if you are willing. The number was written at the bottom in the same handwriting. The kettle began to sound. Nora set the letter down carefully. She sat at the table in her father's kitchen in the house on the property that had always been hers, and she looked at the phone number at the bottom of the page and listened to the kettle and let herself feel the full weight of the moment, which was considerable, and then let herself set it down and then picked it up again to look at it from a different angle. The way you handled things that were very large by approaching them in stages rather than all at once. Rex lay down near her feet, not blocking the door, just there close the way he was always close. The kettle reached its full sound and she got up and made the tea and brought it back to the table and sat with it in her hands and looked at the number. She thought about Margaret Wren in 1974 carrying a lantern up through the forest in October, beginning to build something in a mountain. She thought about Margaret Wren in 1981, sitting at Mabel Quinn's desk 3 days after giving birth, signing documents with the careful hand of a woman who understood that the paper she was creating would have to outlast her ability to be present. She thought about March 1982, going somewhere they would not look and staying there and watching from a distance for 40 years and waiting. She thought about a letter in 2019 postmarked Oregon 3 sentences. She thought about Mabel receiving it and reading it and filing it with the same careful attention she had given to everything else, waiting for the day it would be needed. She thought about the last line of it. I would very much like to hear your voice if you are willing. Nora picked up her phone. She looked at the number on the page. She looked at Rex, who raised his head and met her eyes with the steady, patient look that meant whatever you decide, I'm here. She dialed. It rang twice. Hello? The voice on the other end was a woman's, older, careful, carrying the particular quality of someone who had been managing their own exposure for a very long time and did so automatically without thinking about it the way Nora breathed. Nora said nothing for a moment. She held the phone and listened to the breathing on the other end and let the distance between them, the 40 years and the 2,000 miles and everything that had been done to keep both of them alive, exist in the silence between the words. It's Nora, she said. On the other end, a long pause. long enough that she wondered if the connection had dropped. And then the sound of something releasing, the specific sound of something held for a very long time being finally let go. I know, the voice said. I could hear it. You breathe exactly like her. Her. Nora understood. Her father. The woman who had raised her. The one who had known how to hold silences that were not absences. She said, I found the notebook. Yes, the voice said, I thought you would. I thought the dog would make sure of it. They were quiet together for a moment, two people on either end of a distance that was also a time, 40 years of it, finding their way toward each other from opposite edges. I have a lot of questions, Nora said. I know, said the voice. I have 40 years of answers. We will need more than one phone call. Nora looked at the map on the table. The Eastern Ridge surveyed and documented its boundaries, clear, its ownership no longer in question. She looked at the notebook beside it, the leather cover that had waited in the dark for the person it had been left for. She looked at the chain, the leaf pendant MW. She looked at the window, at the dark beyond it, at the ridge she could not see, but knew was there, holding its stone room with its cold fire pit and its empty shelves and its shaft of light that came down through the rock each morning, regardless of who was there to see it. I'm going to come see you, Nora said. The breathing on the other end changed. Not dramatically, just slightly, in the way that breathing changed when something that had been held very carefully was allowed to rest. I know, the voice said. They stayed on the line for a long time after that, not saying everything, saying some things, finding the beginning of a language that would take more than one conversation to build. Outside, the Vermont winter was what it was, cold and committed, holding the ridge and the forest and the apple tree in the yard under its weight of snow. Inside the kitchen, the tea went cold in the cup, and Rex lay at Nora's feet, and the file from Mabel Quinn sat open on the table with its 40 years of careful waiting. The next morning, Nora went up the ridge alone. Rex came with her, which meant she did not go alone. But she did not bring anything else. Just the dog and the jacket and the boots and the muscle memory of the climb that she already owned after 2 ascents, the ground already familiar in the way that significant ground became familiar quickly. The entrance was exactly where she had left it. The iron ring, the stone wall, the geometry of intention beneath the accumulated seasons. She pulled the door open, less resistant, now that she had broken its seal, and went in. The chamber was cold. The fire had long since gone to ash. She stood in it and let her eyes adjust to the gray light coming down through the shaft above the winter light that reached this room every morning, and had reached it every morning for 50 years, patient and indifferent and present. She looked at the room that Margaret Wren had built. The walls, the platform, the shelves, the fire pit blackened by years of use, the basin where water dripped in from above, all of it exactly as it had been left by the last person to use it, preserved by the dry, still air and by the mountain's patience. She would not change it. She understood that without having to think about it. This place had been built with intention and preserved by intention, and she was not going to alter it into something it had not been made to be. It would remain what it was. A room inside a mountain built by a woman who understood that documentation was the only armor that lasted, that built things endured when the people who built them could not. She sat on the stone platform for a while in the cold and the quiet. Rex sat beside her, his shoulder pressing against hers, his dark eyes moving slowly around the room in the quiet loops of an animal that was resting but never truly still. She thought about what came next, not as a problem to be solved, but as a shape to be understood. The legal process, which would be what Sylvia had correctly described as complex, and which she was prepared to navigate with the attorney Delia had recommended, and the documents from Mabel's file, and the patient attention to procedure that her years of training had given her. The land, 340 acres of Vermont forest, which would require decisions about use and stewardship that she was not ready to make hastily. The timber operations, which would require an accounting that the Calder family was not going to find pleasant. The house, which was technically separate from the ridge and subject to a different legal calculation, and which she had not yet decided how to think about. And Oregon. The phone call that had lasted 2 hours the night before and had ended not because they had run out of things to say, but because the hour had gotten late and they had both understood without saying so explicitly that there would be other calls, that this was a beginning rather than an accounting. You breathe exactly like her. She thought about her father, about the quality of those silences, which she understood now, not as walls, but as a specific form of love. The love that protected rather than expressed itself. The love that showed up on the first of every month without fail, and described the weather in the apple tree, and never once said the thing it was really saying, which was, I am here, I have not left you, are not alone in this. She had not been. She had never been. Rex stood up. He stretched with the unhurried ease of an animal that had completed its rest and was ready for whatever came next. He looked at her. Then he walked to the entrance of the passage and stopped and looked back. Nora looked at him. She thought about what Margaret had written in the last pages of the notebook, the entry that had not finished, and then the single line that had followed it. If I do not come back, the dog will know. Not a mystical claim, a practical one. A woman who had watched the land carefully for years, who had documented wind direction and temperature variation and the behavior of everything that lived in and around this place, making a practical observation about the kind of knowledge that was not written down and could not be transferred through documentation, the kind that lived in a body and moved toward what it needed without being told. Rex had known. He had known on a driveway in a snowstorm on the worst night of Nora's adult life. He had stood between her and the road and closed his teeth around her sleeve and turned her toward a mountain. She owed him more than she could calculate. She put her hand on his head briefly, the way she always did, and then she stood and adjusted her jacket and followed him through the passage. Outside, the morning was what Vermont mornings were in December, cold and clear and unequivocal. The sky, the particular blue that only existed in the combination of latitude and season, and the specific clarity that followed serious weather. The snow on the ridge was undisturbed around the entrance. No tracks but hers and Rex's from the night before, 2 sets going up and 2 sets going down, and then hers from this morning overlapping with the old ones. She stood at the entrance for a moment and looked out at the forest. The trees were old, Vermont old, which was different from old in places where the land had been cleared and replanted and cleared again. These trees had been growing on this ridge since before anyone living remembered the kind of growth that only happened when land was left alone for long enough to develop its own logic. 340 acres of it. Old-growth hardwood that had been extracted without permission for 40 years by people who had hoped that no one withstanding to object would ever arrive. She had arrived. She looked at the ridge, at the trees standing in their morning light, at the snow between them that was unbroken in every direction. She thought about Margaret building this place in 1974, coming up here with stone and tools and the patient intention of someone who understood that what she was building had to outlast her presence in it, coming back season after season to maintain it, to keep it ready, writing everything down, measuring and recording, trusting that the documentation would survive even if she could not. That was the inheritance Nora understood. Not the land exactly, though the land was real and had value and was hers. The inheritance was the practice. The understanding lived and demonstrated across years and decades that the things worth having were worth building carefully and maintaining and protecting with whatever was available. And that documentation outlasted everything else, and that love expressed itself most fully, not in what it said, but in what it prepared. Her father had sewn a map into the lining of a bag. Margaret had built a room inside a mountain. Mabel Quinn had kept a file for 40 years in the bottom drawer of her desk. Nora breathed in the cold air and let it out slowly, and looked at the forest, and understood that she was not the end of something. She was the point to which all of it had been aimed. The inheritor, not just of the land, but of the practice, the way of moving through the world, that understood that silence was sometimes armor, and preparation was sometimes love. And some places were not ready for you yet, but that did not mean they were not waiting. Rex turned and began moving down the slope toward the house. Not urgently, at the pace of someone who had accomplished what they came to accomplish and was ready for what came next. Nora followed him. They came out of the tree line into the yard and crossed it through the new snow. their tracks joining the ones they had made before, layering over them, building a record of the times they had walked this ground together. The apple tree stood in the middle of the yard, bare and wide and old, its branches making the silhouette she had looked at from every window of this house for the first 18 years of her life, and had looked at in a photograph from a chamber under the ridge, and had looked at this morning through the kitchen window while the kettle heated. She put her hand on the bark as she passed it, rough and cold and solid. The tree did not care about any of what had happened. It had been growing here since before she was born, and it would be growing here after she was gone, and it held everything it had witnessed with the complete indifference of a living thing that was not organized around human significance. She found that restful. She went inside. The kitchen was the way she had left it. The file from Mabel Quinn on the table, the notebook beside it, the map, the photograph, the chain, the cup on the drying rack. She picked up the cup. She looked at it for a moment, at the chip on the rim and the worn smoothness of the handle and the ring of old coffee dried on the inside. Then she put it back in the cabinet where it had lived for as long as she could remember, next to the place where her father's cup always sat, in the specific spot where a particular hand had reached for it every morning for 20 years. She filled the kettle again and put it on the stove again and sat down at the table with the file open in front of her. She had calls to make. The attorney in Burlington, the county land office. Eventually, when the legal process had advanced far enough, the state agency that oversaw unauthorized timber extraction, which would initiate a process that the Calder family was not going to find comfortable. These were real things that required real attention, and she was capable of giving them both. But first, she looked at the phone on the table, at the number she had saved from the bottom of Margaret's letter. She had told her she would come, not when. The when was still being worked out, the way all the whens were still being worked out, the shape of the next chapter taking form in the same gradual way that the shape of the last one had revealed itself one piece at a time, starting with a dog on a driveway who had known where to go. Rex lay down near the back door, not blocking it, just there the way he was always there, present and steady and entirely certain of his place in the arrangement. The kettle began to sound. Outside, the ridge held its cold and its stone room, and its 40 years of patient waiting, and its shaft of morning light. In Burlington, a file cabinet in an office on Ridgeline Street was slightly emptier than it had been for the past 4 decades, its most important contents finally delivered to the person they had been prepared for. In Oregon, a woman who breathed a certain way was moving through her morning in a place chosen for its distance from being found waiting for the call that would tell her whether the distance could now be reduced. Nora poured the water over the tea. She put the cup in her hands and let the warmth come through. She looked at the ridge through the kitchen window, at the line of trees against the sky, at the place on the slope where the entrance was invisible from this angle and this distance exactly as it was designed to be. She was not starting over. A person did not start over at 43. What she did at 43, if she was paying attention, was understand what she had been doing all along. She had been moving toward this. Every tour, every silence, every mile of road driven with the radio off. Every night in a canvas cot in a place that was not home. She had been moving toward the tree in the yard, in the room in the mountain, in the letters in her pocket, in the file in Burlington, and the voice on the phone that said, "I know I could hear it, you breathe exactly like her." She had been moving toward the moment when she would understand what the language of her childhood had actually been saying underneath the silences, and the apple tree updates and the monthly letters that never said the thing they were saying, which was, "You are not alone in this. We are all here. We have all been here the whole time." Rex looked at her from across the kitchen, his dark eyes steady, his posture relaxed but never entirely without attention, the permanent half-readiness of an animal who had understood that his job was ongoing and who had never once been wrong about when it was needed. She looked at the phone. She looked at the ridge. Then she picked up the phone and dialed the number in Oregon and waited for the answer that she already knew was coming, because some places that weren't ready for you yet became ready in their time, and this one had been waiting long enough.